My brother disappeared 20 years ago. But last night my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I was sitting in my apartment in Portland, finishing up some code for a client, when the phone started buzzing on the desk beside me. At first, I ignored it. Midnight calls almost never bring good news. But it didn't stop. It just kept lighting up. One vibration after another. The same number flashing over and over again. I frowned, leaned closer, and froze. It was Michael's number. For a second I thought it had to be a mistake. His number had been disconnected back in 2006. I knew because I'd kept paying for it for a few years after the accident, hoping maybe he'd call. Eventually, the carrier recycled it. But there it was, clear as day. And missed calls. Same number. Same area code from Seattle. I picked it up and stared at the screen, waiting for it to ring again. It did. My chest tightened. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the green icon. Then I answered. Nothing. No voice. Just breathing. Slow. Uneven. I said hello twice. My own voice cracking. The line hissed softly like wind across snow. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A whisper. Almost lost in the static. Ethan. I froze. My name. My brother's voice. Older. Raspier. But unmistakable. I said his name out loud before I could stop myself. Michael. The line clicked and went dead. I stared at the phone, my hand shaking. The call log still showed his number. I scrolled back through the list. 80 calls. All within the last 3 hours. Between midnight and 3 a.m. I opened the Messages app. One new text blinked on the screen. It's me. I'm not dead. My throat tightened. I whispered the words like saying them out loud might make them make sense. It's me. I'm not dead. For a long minute I just sat there, trying to breathe. The hum of my refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. I wanted to believe it was some glitch. A cruel joke. Something explainable. But then my phone buzzed again. A voicemail notification. I didn't remember hearing it ring that time. I hit play. Ethan. Please pick up. The message was short. 10 seconds maybe. It was his voice. Tired and distant. Like it had come from somewhere deep underground. I felt the air leave my lungs. I replayed it. And for a moment I thought I heard something new under his words. Like shuffling. Maybe a door closing. I listened again. My pulse thudded in my ears. It wasn't imagination. There was background noise. Faint and rhythmic. Like footsteps on concrete. I checked the timestamp. The voicemail had arrived exactly 1 hour ago. The metadata showed the signal originated from Seattle. My hands were sweating. I opened my laptop. Pulled up a site that tracks call data through IP routes. The coordinates landed near the South Industrial District. Not far from the port. My mind was racing. It couldn't be real. I told myself it was probably someone spoofing the number. That was possible. Right, but who would do that? Who would know that number? That voice. I tried to calm down. But every part of me felt wired and electric. I got up, paced the room, then sat back down and pressed play again. The breathing. The whisper. My name. Ethan. It felt like time folded in half. Like 20 years had vanished in a heartbeat. I remembered the day they called to say the truck had gone off the mountain road. The freezing rain. The news crews. The half-buried wreckage. 5 bodies recovered. 1 missing. The body they handed me was burned. Swollen. Unrecognizable. They said it was Michael. Based on a jacket and a wallet found near the crash. I didn't ask for more proof. I couldn't. My stomach turned as I thought about it. What if I'd buried the wrong person? The phone buzzed again, snapping me back. One more voicemail. My heart hammered as I pressed play. This time the message was longer. The first few seconds were silence. Then that same rough breathing. And then, again. My name. But this time it came out like a plea. Ethan. Help me. I dropped the phone. It hit the floor. The sound sharp in the empty room. I bent down. Picked it up. Pressed play again. Needing to be sure. The message repeated exactly the same way. I looked at the timestamp. The call had come from a device registered years ago under North Trail Logistics. The same company Michael had worked for before the accident. My mouth went dry. Outside. A car passed slowly down the street. Headlights cutting across my window. I pulled the blinds down and sat back at the desk. The phone lay beside me. Screen black. Quiet now. I stayed there until dawn, staring at it, afraid it might start ringing again. My coffee had gone cold. Every time I blinked, I saw that text burned into my mind. It's me. I'm not dead. By sunrise, I'd convinced myself I needed to see where that signal came from. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I wasn't going to find out sitting in the dark. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The air was damp and cold. The kind of chill that bites behind your eyes. As I locked the door, the phone vibrated once more. No ringtone this time. Just a single buzz and a new voicemail. I didn't listen right away. I sat behind the wheel. Engine idling. Rain starting to fall harder. And finally pressed play. The message began with that same sound of breathing. Then, clearer than before, my brother's voice, trembling. Don't come here. They're watching. The line went dead. I looked up through the windshield. Across the street, a black pickup truck was parked. Engine running. Someone sitting inside. I couldn't see his face, but I felt his eyes on me. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a joke. Whatever had happened 20 years ago wasn't finished. And somehow, my brother was still out there. I turned the key harder than I meant to, and the car jerked forward onto the street. The black pickup didn't move right away. I kept my eyes on it in the rearview mirror as I pulled away from the curb. When it finally turned in the opposite direction, a knot in my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe again. Driving through the wet morning. My mind was already drifting back 20 years. I didn't want it to. But once it started, there was no stopping it. I could still see the mountain road on the news footage. The mangled trailer. The flashing red lights against falling snow. I remembered the phone call that had come before that. The one that told me there'd been an accident on Snoqualmie Pass. Michael had been 17 then. Working his first real job with North Trail Logistics. Hauling shipments between Seattle and Spokane. I was 20. Too busy with my own life to notice how proud he'd been to finally be out there on his own. When they told me his truck had gone over the guardrail during a storm, I didn't ask questions. I just drove out there. Numb. They didn't find him right away. Search crews combed the slope for 2 days. The wreck was twisted like metal confetti, half buried in snow and mud. When they finally pulled a body out, they said it had to be him. The wallet matched. The jacket matched. Mom couldn't bring herself to look. So I did it. I stood under the harsh light in a cold room while a coroner pulled back a sheet. It was barely a person. The face was swollen and burned. The skin pale from the cold. I stared too long, trying to convince myself I recognized something familiar. A jawline, maybe. The shape of a nose. In the end, I nodded because the alternative was impossible. Yes, I said. That's him. The drive to Seattle passed like a fog. Every building that slid by felt like a ghost of something I used to know. I stopped once for gas outside Tacoma, but I barely remembered getting back on the road. I thought about Mom, about the way she never recovered after that winter. She kept his room the same for years. The bed made, clothes folded, as if he might walk back in any day. When she got sick and I was cleaning the house, I found his toolbox under the bed, still full of sockets and wrenches, all arranged by size the way he liked it. I couldn't throw it out. It's still in my garage. Mom died in 2018. Heart failure. Though I think grief had done most of the work long before that. I remember sitting in the kitchen after the funeral with my ex-wife, Samantha, and saying that I wished I could have done something more for her. She told me it wasn't my fault. But she was wrong. I was the one who said yes in that room 20 years ago. I was the one who told everyone he was gone. Rain streaked across the windshield as the highway curved north. I tried to shake off the memories, but the phone on the seat beside me kept drawing my eye. The black screen seemed to hum with some quiet energy, like it was waiting to wake up again. At a diner outside Kent, I pulled over. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a trucker sipping coffee in his cab. Inside, the smell of bacon and cheap coffee hit me like a memory from childhood. I took a booth near the window and ordered without thinking. When the waitress left, I pulled up the voicemail again, headphones in this time, and turned the volume all the way up. There it was, breathing, my name. Then, faintly under it, another sound I hadn't noticed before. Wind, maybe rain, and a metallic clang. Like a door shutting against a frame. The background hiss shifted midway through. And for a second, I swore I could hear another voice whisper something short and sharp before cutting off. I rewound it 5 times and couldn't make out what it said. Maybe it wasn't a word at all. When the food came, I barely touched it. The waitress asked if I was all right, and I forced a smile. Just tired, I said. Back in the car, I checked the route to the coordinates that had shown up in the metadata. South Seattle, near the old industrial port, a cluster of warehouses that had been mostly abandoned when North Trail moved their operations east years ago. It was almost noon when I reached the city. The sky hung low and gray, the rain turning to mist that coated everything in a dull shine. The streets near the docks were half flooded, puddles reflecting chain-link fences and broken lights. I parked near a warehouse that matched the coordinates. The sign above the gate was rusted. Letters faded, but still legible. North Trail Logistics. Est. Etienne Joe by Tsishizen. My stomach turned. I hadn't seen that logo in 2 decades. I climbed through a gap in the fence, the sound of dripping water echoing in the stillness. The warehouse doors were chained, but a side entrance hung half open. Inside, the air smelled of metal and mildew. Empty pallets were stacked against the walls. In the corner, a table, an old chair, and a phone charger plugged into a portable generator. On the table sat a phone. It was scratched, scuffed, the kind of model that hadn't been sold since the early 2000s. The case was red, chipped at the corner. I reached for it, my pulse thudding. The home screen lit up weakly. Battery at 3%. 1 missed call. I tapped the log. The last outgoing number matched mine. I dropped it back on the table and stepped away. Someone had been here. Recently. Outside. Gravel crunched. I turned to the sound and saw headlights sweep across the inside wall. A black pickup rolled past the entrance. Slowed. Then kept going. I waited until it was gone before stepping out into the drizzle. The phone in my pocket buzzed. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Stop looking." I spun around, scanning the street. But it was empty. Only the distant hum of traffic and the gulls over the water. Back in the car, I sat for a while, hands gripping the wheel, trying to slow my breathing. Part of me wanted to drive straight home, throw the phone into the river, and forget any of this had happened. But that message, that voice, those calls, none of it would let me. By the time I started the engine, the sun was gone behind the clouds. The city lights came on, flickering orange through the mist. I didn't know what I was chasing anymore. Only that if I turned back now, I'd never stop wondering what was waiting for me in those warehouses. Or who didn't want me to find it. I checked the voicemail one more time before pulling onto the street. The same message played. Only this time, right before it ended, there was something new. A faint thud. Then my name again. Ethan. But the tone was different now. Urgent. Scared. I shut it off and stared at the dark road ahead. A thought crawling through my mind like a splinter. If that wasn't a recording from the past, then my brother was still alive. I left the house before dawn. The sky still a dark gray blur over the city. The streets were slick from last night's rain, and every light reflected off the asphalt like a mirror. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. My brother's name looping in my head like a song that wouldn't end. Michael. It had been 20 years since the truck accident that supposedly took his life. 20 years since I'd stood in that morgue, staring at what they told me was him. But now, after 80 missed calls and that single message, everything I thought I knew was unraveling. By the time I reached the outskirts of Seattle, the sun was bleeding through the clouds. I pulled over at a diner off I-90. The kind of place where the coffee tastes like burnt earth, but the waitresses call you honey. I needed time to think. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and scrolled through my phone again. The number that had sent the text was disconnected now. No voicemail. No trace. I'd already tried calling it half a dozen times. Each time it went straight to silence. I remembered what the message said: "I'm not dead." It wasn't a prank. I could feel that in my gut. Whoever sent it knew too much. Maybe even had his phone, his voice, his memory. I needed a place to start. I opened the old folder from my home office. The one labeled North Trail Logistics. The logo still haunted me. Michael had started working there just months before the accident. His truck had been part of a winter shipment run from Spokane to Portland. The police report said it went off the highway during a snowstorm, killing everyone on board. The company went bankrupt a few years later, after a series of lawsuits. But if he wasn't dead, then what really happened? I left the diner and drove east toward Snoqualmie Pass, the stretch of highway where they'd found the wreckage. The road curved around sharp ridges of pine and rock, still damp from melting snow. I pulled over at the old mile marker, the one that used to be part of the investigation photos. The guardrail was new, shiny metal, replacing the one from 2 decades ago. The air was cold and still. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the wind through the trees. That's when I heard it. A faint ringing sound. Distant, but real. I turned, scanning the road. It wasn't a phone. More like the echo of one. I followed it down the slope toward the tree line, my boots sinking into soft mud. The sound faded, then came back again. I found it half buried under a piece of rusted metal. A phone. Old. Black. Cracked screen. Covered in dirt. I turned it over, and the label on the back was almost unreadable. Horizon Freight Solutions. I froze. That company didn't exist 20 years ago. It was the rebranded version of North Trail. The same one that took over after the bankruptcy. I brushed the dirt off the screen and pressed the power button. It buzzed weakly, then flickered on. There was only one contact in the call log. My number. Before I could think, the phone vibrated in my hand. The screen flashed. Incoming call. Unknown. I hesitated, my breath catching. Then I answered. There was nothing at first. Just static and the faint crackle of wind. Then, a voice, low and rough, came through. Ethan. My throat tightened. Who is this? You know who I am. It sounded like Michael. Older. Broken. But undeniably him. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. Where are you? I said. He didn't answer right away. Then he whispered. I don't know. I keep waking up somewhere new. What does that mean? They move us. Us. Static swallowed his words. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. Michael. What are you talking about? Who's moving you? The line cracked again. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. They said I belonged to them. The call ended. I stood there, staring at the dead screen. My hands shaking. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. My breath came out in clouds. I tried calling back, but the phone was completely dead. I took it back to the car and sat behind the wheel, staring at the Horizon logo on the back of the device. The company had changed names, changed faces, but it was the same one that had owned the truck Michael drove the night he vanished. If what he said was true, he wasn't the only one they took. Back in Seattle, I found a storage unit listed under Horizon Freight Solutions. The address matched one from the old company records. It was down by the port, near a line of empty warehouses. I parked outside just before dusk. The air smelled like salt and diesel. The lock on the door was new, too clean for a place that should have been abandoned. I picked it open with a screwdriver from the glove compartment. Inside, the space was bare except for a folding table, a generator, and a stack of crates. I turned on my phone's flashlight and walked closer. One of the crates had a tag that read, Employee Assets. I pried it open. Inside were rows of ID badges. Each one had a name, a number, a faded photograph. Most of them looked like they hadn't been touched in years, but one was recent. The photo was blurred, but I recognized the eyes immediately. Michael Cole. The badge listed an employee, number HFS 017. I took a step back, my pulse racing. Someone had kept his identity active. Someone had been updating it. Then I heard it again. The faint ring of a phone. This time it was inside the room. I turned off my flashlight and froze. The ringing came from the corner, near the crates. Slowly, I walked toward it. The sound stopped just as I reached for it. Something moved behind me. I spun around, light cutting across the room. A shadow darted past the doorway. Footsteps echoing down the hall. I ran out after it, my heart hammering in my chest. Outside, the air was cold and wet. I caught a glimpse of a figure disappearing into the fog toward the docks. I chased, slipping on the slick pavement, yelling for them to stop. They didn't. By the time I reached the end of the dock, they were gone. All that was left was the sound of the tide against the wood and the faint smell of oil. I stood there breathing hard, soaked with rain, staring into the darkness. Whoever they were, they knew I was coming, and they wanted me to find that phone, somewhere out there. My brother was still alive, but now I understood something I hadn't before. Someone else wanted to make sure he stayed lost. I spent the next morning glued to my laptop, the phone beside me like a loaded weapon I didn't want to touch. I'd barely slept. The voicemail looped in my head. My brother's voice whispering from somewhere that shouldn't exist. I kept telling myself I needed proof. Something concrete to hold on to. By mid-morning, I called Laura Bennett. She was an old friend from college. Now a civil attorney in Seattle. We hadn't talked in years. But I knew she handled corporate cases. When she picked up, her voice was cautious. Polite at first. Then concerned when she heard my tone. "Ethan, are you okay?" I took a breath. "I need your help with something. And it's strange." She hesitated. "How strange are we talking?" "Strange enough that I don't know if I'm losing my mind or not." I told her about the calls, the texts, the warehouse, the phone I found. I left out the part about the truck following me. I didn't want to sound paranoid, though I probably already did. When I finished, she didn't laugh. Instead, she said quietly, "Ethan, you know North Trail folded a few years ago." "Right. No. I thought they just restructured. They filed for bankruptcy in 2019. There were lawsuits, workplace injuries, fraud, something about hidden safety reports. It was ugly." "Can you pull the old accident report from 2005? I asked. There was a pause on the line. "Sure. Give me a few hours." While I waited, I brewed coffee I didn't drink and watched rain smear the window. My hands wouldn't stop moving. Tapping the desk. The mug. My leg. I checked my email every few minutes until Laura finally called back. "I got the report," she said. "There's something off about it." "Off how?" "Well, first of all, the document's been sealed. You can't do that unless there's an ongoing legal reason. It says, restricted by internal corporate request. And there's a note on the digital file that it was modified in 2006. Modified. By who? It doesn't say. Just an internal tag. But that's not the weirdest part. There's a line in the recovery notes about a survivor. My pulse spiked. A survivor? Yeah. It says one person pulled from the wreck. Transported before emergency crews arrived. Then it's redacted. No name. No location. I felt cold all over. "Laura, can you send me that file?" "Already did. Check your inbox." The email popped up a minute later. The report was heavily blacked out. Whole sections missing. But she was right. Near the bottom of the second page, a handwritten note scanned into the file said exactly what she'd described. One survivor evacuated before scene clearance. I called her back immediately. "Who wrote this note?" "The signature's hard to read," she said. "Looks like J something. Could be a rescue worker." I zoomed in on the image. J. Peterson. Jack Peterson. I said under my breath. I remembered that name. I'd seen it on the old news reports about the crash. He'd been one of the first search and rescue responders on Snoqualmie Pass. Laura must have heard the change in my voice. "You know him?" "I did. 20 years ago." "You think he's still around?" "Only one way to find out." She exhaled. "Ethan, I don't know what you're hoping to find. But if someone's gone through this much trouble to bury records, they're not going to like you digging them up. That makes two of us," I said, and hung up. It took me 2 hours to track down an address for Jack Peterson. He lived just outside Olympia now. Retired. When I pulled into his driveway, an old retriever barked weakly from the porch. The house was small, weathered, with tools scattered across a workbench in the open garage. Jack answered the door slower than I expected. His hair was white, his face lined, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at me like he'd already guessed why I was there. "You're one of the Cole boys, aren't you?" he said before I could speak. I nodded. "Ethan." He sighed and stepped back. motioning for me to come in. The living room smelled like wood smoke and coffee. Photos lined the walls. Most of them old rescue team shots from mountain ranges across the state. You still think about that crash? Don't you? He asked quietly. Every day. He sat down heavily in a chair near the window. You want the truth? That's all I came for. He stared out at the rain for a long moment before speaking. There were 6 people on that truck. 5 bodies were recovered. The 6th, well, that's the part they didn't want to talk about. I leaned forward. Go on. We found a young man alive near the tree line. He was unconscious, but breathing. I radioed it in. But before the paramedics arrived, a van from North Trail showed up. 2 men in safety jackets got out. They said the kid was one of their drivers, that they'd take him to a company facility for treatment. I didn't think much of it at the time. And you let them. He met my eyes. I did. We were told to stand down. The van left before state troopers even arrived. A few days later, my report was rewritten. Rewritten by who? He gave a small shrug. Someone from the company. They said the boy died at the scene. You saw him alive. I did. I swallowed hard. Could that have been my brother? He rubbed a hand over his face. Could be. He was about your age then. Dark hair. Scar on his left arm, maybe 6 inches long. That's him, I said. My voice breaking. That's Michael. Jack looked down. Guilt flickering across his expression. I didn't know what they were doing. I thought I was helping. You did what they told you. I don't blame you. He looked back up at me. If what you're saying about those calls is true, maybe he's still out there. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. I just nodded. As I stood to leave, he handed me an old folder. I kept this, he said quietly. It's the original report before they changed it. You might find something useful. Outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and cold. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the folder in my hands. Inside were photographs of the crash, handwritten notes, and a name scrawled on the back of a page. Supervisor on site, Aaron Blake. The CEO. The same man who'd built North Trail into a national company. The same man who'd buried my brother 20 years ago, without a trace. My reflection stared back at me in the windshield. Eyes hollow. Jaw tight. I started the engine and whispered to myself, this isn't over. I drove straight back to Seattle. The sound of the wipers scraping against the glass like a slow heartbeat that wouldn't stop. My mind kept looping over the name I'd seen in Jack Peterson's report. Aaron Blake. I'd heard that name before. Back when Michael first started at North Trail, Blake had been the young executive everyone admired. The man who turned a small trucking company into a nationwide logistics chain. He'd built his success on speed, efficiency, and silence. By the time I got home, the rain had turned into a mist that clung to my jacket. I dropped my keys on the counter and called Laura. She picked up on the second ring. Tell me you found something, she said before I could speak. I did. Jack Peterson. He was there at the crash. He saw a survivor. Her tone changed instantly. That's impossible. The report lists 5 fatalities. No survivors. He told me North Trail's own people took the survivor away before the state troopers arrived. You're saying they covered it up. I'm saying they took someone. I think it was my brother. There was silence on the other end. Then Laura said quietly, if that's true, Ethan, this isn't just corporate negligence. That's a crime. I rubbed a hand over my face. Yeah. I know. I emailed her the photos from Jack's folder. The old reports. The signature. When I finished, she said she'd dig into Blake's current records. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the laptop screen. the cursor blinking on an empty search bar. I typed Aaron Blake Seattle and hit enter. Dozens of articles popped up. North Trail's bankruptcy. Blake's rebranding into a new company called Horizon Freight Solutions. Photos of him at charity galas. Smiling for cameras. Shaking hands with city officials. The man looked untouchable. I found an address for one of Horizon's satellite offices near Pioneer Square. I didn't think. I just drove. The lobby was sleek. Glass walls and polished wood. A receptionist smiled politely until she saw the look on my face. I asked if Aaron Blake was in. She said he was in meetings all day. I left my number anyway. Told her to tell him Ethan Cole stopped by. She didn't write it down. But I knew she wouldn't forget. When I stepped back outside, the street felt heavier somehow. A group of men in suits walked past. Talking low. I thought I saw one glance at me longer than he should have. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The black pickup showed up again. Parked 2 blocks away from my apartment. I turned off all the lights and watched from the window. It sat there for almost an hour before disappearing into the dark. I barely slept. By morning, Laura called again. "You were right," she said. Blake was at the crash site that night. I sat up in bed. How do you know? His name's on the internal logistics log. Listed as an operations supervisor on duty. There's no reason a regional VP should have been anywhere near that mountain. My stomach dropped. Laura continued. There's more. The day after the crash, North Trail filed an insurance claim that listed 6 employees as passengers. Not 5. That extra name was later removed from the records. 6. I repeated quietly. She exhaled. Ethan. If your brother was the 6th person, then someone intentionally erased him from every document tied to that night. I felt the room tilt slightly. Then where the hell has he been for 20 years? I don't know, she said softly. But if you're right about that phone, maybe he's trying to tell you. I hung up and opened the old folder Jack had given me. Among the photos, there was one that stopped me cold. A grainy shot of a crowd at the crash site. 2 men in reflective jackets carrying someone between them. The body was slumped but upright. Alive. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred. On the jacket of one of the men, faint but visible, was a logo. North Trail Logistics. And next to it, the letters HFS stenciled in marker. Horizon Freight Solutions. The name Blake's company took after the bankruptcy. I pressed my fingers to my temples. It couldn't be coincidence. Horizon was the new face of the same operation. That night I went back to the Port District. To the same warehouse where I'd found the phone. It was darker now. Colder. The smell of salt and rust hung heavy in the air. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way on foot. Inside. The table was still there. The generator gone. The phone missing. But in the dust on the tabletop was a fresh footprint. And a cigarette butt still faintly smoking near the wall. I froze. Listening. Somewhere deeper inside. Metal scraped against metal. I followed the sound. Moving slow between rows of empty pallets. A shadow shifted ahead of me. Tall. Thin. Moving unevenly. I stopped. My voice came out rough. Michael. The shadow froze. When he turned, the beam from my flashlight hit his face. His hair was longer. Streaked gray at the edges. His eyes sunken but alive. A scar ran along his left arm. Faint but unmistakable. He blinked like the light hurt him. Ethan, he whispered. You came. I could barely speak. How are you here? He took a shaky step toward me. Then another. His lips trembled. I tried to tell you. Then his knees gave out, and he collapsed. I caught him before he hit the ground. His body light, bones pressing through thin layers of skin. He was breathing fast, shallow, eyes darting behind closed lids. I pulled my jacket around him, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. His pulse was weak but steady. "Hold on," I said. "I've got you now." He mumbled something I couldn't make out. A name, maybe, or a place. Then his head lolled against my shoulder. I carried him out of the warehouse, every step echoing in the empty space. The rain had started again by the time I reached the car. As I laid him across the back seat, I caught sight of something on his forearm under the dirt. A number, faded but still visible, written in black ink. HFS 017. My stomach dropped. Horizon Freight Solutions. I looked back toward the warehouse. Somewhere inside, I thought I saw movement again. A figure watching from the shadows. I slammed the door, started the engine, and sped toward the nearest hospital. Heart pounding against my ribs, knowing whatever I had stumbled into was only beginning. At the hospital, they took him in without questions once they saw the state he was in. The nurses moved quickly, checking vitals, drawing blood, asking about allergies. I stood by, useless. My clothes soaked, answering what I could. His name? Michael Cole. My brother. Lost for 20 years. They asked for an address. I said I didn't know. They asked where I found him. I lied and said he had shown up at my place. They admitted him for observation and told me to wait outside. I sat in the corridor watching the rain smear the windows, my hands shaking even though the room was warm. Every few minutes, someone passed in scrubs. But no one looked at me. The world felt muffled, like sound had gone underwater. A doctor finally approached. A woman with short hair and clear, tired eyes. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Lang. She said Michael was malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from old, untreated injuries. Head trauma, broken ribs that had healed wrong, scars on his back and legs. She asked if I knew where he'd been all these years. I told her no. She frowned. "There's something else," she said. "He has markings on his arm." I nodded. I saw them. HFS 017. She looked at me carefully. "You know what it means. Horizon Freight Solutions. I think it's connected to the company he worked for before the accident." Her brow furrowed. "That would mean he's been in contact with them recently." "He has not just been in contact," I said. "I think they kept him." For a moment her professional calm cracked. "You believe he was held?" "I do." She hesitated. "If that's true, he's going to need both medical and psychological help. When he wakes up, I'd like to run a trauma assessment." He woke up that evening. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the light. When he saw me, he flinched at first, then relaxed. His voice was a rasp. "Ethan." I leaned forward. "Yeah, it's me." He looked confused, like the word "me" didn't mean what he thought it did. "How long?" he whispered. 20 years. He closed his eyes. His throat moved like he was trying to swallow air. "Where were you?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not sure. A place with machines. Noise all the time. They said I owed them for saving me." "Who said that?" He looked at his arm. The faded code. The men in blue jackets. The nurse came in before I could ask more. She adjusted his IV and told me he needed rest. I nodded. But my mind was spinning. The next morning, Dr. Lang called me into her office. She'd gone through his scans. Old fractures. Possible brain trauma from the crash. Evidence of prolonged stress and poor nutrition. She spoke softly, like each fact was a blade she didn't want to use. He's lucky to be alive, she said. But the way these injuries healed, they weren't all from the same time. Some are only a few years old. That means someone hurt him long after that accident. I gripped the arms of the chair. So he didn't just survive the crash. They kept him somewhere. That's my conclusion. But proving it will be hard without documentation. I asked if she could help me get his DNA compared to mine. Just to be certain. She arranged it that afternoon. The results came back the next day. Joe. 9% match. It was him. When I told Laura, she didn't sound surprised. She said she'd been digging deeper into Horizon's archives and found something buried in court filings. Aaron Blake still runs Horizon as CEO. The company quietly bought several abandoned properties near the port. She said, some of them used to be employee housing back in the North Trail days. No inspections. No visitors. If your brother was there, that's where he'd have been kept. My jaw tightened. Can we prove it? Maybe. There's a former employee suing them for unpaid wages. His testimony claims he worked with undocumented laborers off the books. That's not enough. I said, no. But it's a start. She paused. Ethan. If Blake's involved, be careful. He's connected. I looked through the window of the hospital room where Michael was sleeping. The faint rise and fall of his chest steady now. I had already decided what I was going to do. Later that week, I waited outside Horizon's downtown office building until Blake came out. He looked almost exactly like the pictures online. Mid-50s. Clean suit. The polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. When I stepped into his path, he stopped. Confused. Then cautious. Can I help you? He said. I said his name. Aaron Blake. He smiled the way powerful men do when they don't like surprises. Yes. And you are? Ethan Cole. The name didn't seem to register at first. Then his expression flickered just slightly. Cole. Like Michael Cole. You remember him then. He studied me. That was a tragic accident. Why are you bringing it up now? Because my brother's not dead. His jaw moved once before he answered. That's impossible. He's in a hospital right now. I found him near one of your old warehouses. He had your company's code written on his arm. He stared at me for a moment too long. Then gave a thin smile. I think you're mistaken. North Trail has been gone for years. I stepped closer. You might have changed the name. But the blood on your hands didn't wash off. He straightened. Voice colder. If you're accusing me of something, I suggest you talk to a lawyer. Already did. I said. The smile faded. He glanced toward the building, as if considering whether to call security. Then back at me. You don't know what you're getting into. I leaned in. I think I finally do. His eyes narrowed. Walk away. Mr. Cole. Some things are better left buried. He turned and left without another word. The door closing behind him with a soft click. I stood there a long time. The city noise humming around me. My phone buzzed. A message from Laura. Got something. Meet me tomorrow. It's big. Back at the hospital that night. Michael was awake again. His voice was stronger. But his eyes were haunted. He kept rubbing the mark on his arm. They made us work, he said quietly. Fixing trucks. Cleaning. Moving boxes. I think there were others like me. They told us we were lucky. That they saved us. Saved you from what? From freezing to death. He said, looking past me. Then he added, they said I belonged to them. I tried to stay calm. But my stomach turned. Who's they? He shook his head slowly. Faces blur. Always noise. Diesel engines. Someone called Blake the boss. When he said the name, I felt the world tilt again. I sat down beside him. You don't have to remember everything now. You're safe. He looked at me. Voice trembling. Am I? For the first time. I wasn't sure how to answer. Outside the window, the rain started again, tapping softly against the glass. I stayed there until his breathing slowed, and he fell asleep. My own mind, spinning with the truth I could no longer ignore. They hadn't just left him behind after the crash. They had taken him, used him, hidden him, and I wasn't done with Aaron Blake yet. Laura called early the next morning, her voice sharp and restless. She said she had found something that might finally connect Blake to what happened to Michael. I told her I would be there in an hour. I stopped by the hospital first. But Michael was still asleep. Doctor Lang said he had another panic episode during the night. Woke up yelling about engines and fire. She wanted to start him on light medication. I told her to do whatever would help him rest. I didn't say that rest was the last thing I could manage myself. Laura's office was a few blocks from the courthouse. A brick building with no nameplate. When I walked in, she was already standing at the window, her tablet glowing in her hand. You look terrible, she said. I didn't sleep much. What did you find? She turned the screen toward me. A series of scanned documents filled the display. It was a set of internal invoices and purchase orders filed by Horizon Freight Solutions 5 years earlier. Each was labeled Labor Subcontracting, with no vendor listed. Payments made in cash. The signatures at the bottom were the same, Aaron Blake. That's the same kind of paperwork they used before the bankruptcy, she said. The same pattern. No vendor. No oversight. These people were off the books. I stared at the screen. And you think Michael was one of them. I think he was there first. And I think you're right. They kept him because he was convenient. She slid another document toward me. An accident insurance claim dated the day after the crash. It listed 6 employees but only 5 fatalities. The 6th line had been crossed out. That's your brother. Ethan. They erased him by hand. The words hit me like a fist. What do we do now? I asked. We build a case. We start with a civil action. Demand discovery on their employment records. That will bring the rest out. I could tell she was trying to keep it professional. But she looked shaken too. We'll need Michael's statement, I said. When he's ready? Yes. But Ethan, I need you to stay calm. If we push too fast, they'll bury everything again. I nodded. But calm wasn't an option. That afternoon I drove home and sat at my desk replaying every voicemail from my brother again. The same pattern of static, breathing, and faint background noise. But the last one had something new buried at the end. I turned up the volume and listened close. A mechanical clatter. Then a voice I didn't recognize saying, "He knows." I felt the hair rise on my neck. I closed the laptop and looked out the window. Across the street, a dark sedan was parked by the curb, the same one that had followed me a few days earlier. I picked up the phone and called Laura again. Someone's watching me. She didn't hesitate. I'll call a contact at SPD. Just don't do anything stupid. By sunset, the car was gone. But the feeling didn't fade. I tried to distract myself with anything else. But my mind kept circling back to Blake. The way he looked at me outside that building. Like he already knew how the story ended. The next morning I got another call. But it wasn't from Laura. It was a reporter from a small Seattle business journal. She said she'd heard rumors of a lawsuit against Horizon Freight and wanted a comment. I hadn't told anyone yet. So I knew exactly where it came from. Blake. He was trying to control the story before it began. I denied knowing anything and hung up. Half an hour later, Laura called again. Her voice low. Ethan. Blake's dead. I froze. What? There was an accident early this morning. His car went off the interstate near Renton. The police think the brakes failed. I sat down hard. The phone still against my ear. Failed. Yeah. The car was one of Horizon's fleet vehicles. They're running diagnostics now. I couldn't speak. Ethan. You there? Yeah. She hesitated. I know what you're thinking. But this isn't good for us. Without him, the case gets harder. I ended the call and just sat there, staring at the rain sliding down the window. Later that day, the news hit every local station. Photos of the wreckage. Reporters calling it a tragic accident. Horizon Freight released a statement expressing condolences and promising cooperation with investigators. There was no mention of the lawsuits. No mention of the crash in 2005. No mention of the people they used. At the hospital that evening, Michael was awake again. I told him about Blake. He stared at the wall for a long time. Then said quietly, he deserved worse. He said it with no anger. Just exhaustion. Like someone who'd spent all his rage years ago. Did he ever hurt you personally? I asked. Michael shook his head. No. He didn't have to. The people who worked for him did. They called it training. He rubbed the scar on his arm. When one of us got sick or slowed down, they took them away. No one ever came back. My throat went dry. How many were there? At least 10. Maybe more. He looked up at me then. His eyes hollow but steady. They said we were lucky to be alive. That the company gave us a second chance. I believed them for a long time. I wanted to tell him he didn't need to remember. But that would have been a lie. The truth was already there, crawling back piece by piece. That night, I drove to the crash site on Snoqualmie Pass. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see where it all started. The air was cold, thin, and the road still curved the same way. Snow clung to the edges of the guardrail. I parked where the old mile marker used to be and stepped out into the silence. The wind carried the faint smell of pine and fuel. I closed my eyes and tried to picture it. That night, 20 years ago. The storm. The truck sliding off the road. Somewhere down there in the darkness, my brother had crawled out of twisted metal. Alive. Then the men from North Trail had come and taken him. Headlights appeared on the road behind me. Bright against the fog. A car slowed as it passed. Then stopped a few yards ahead. The driver's door opened. But no one got out. I couldn't see the face through the glare. I waited. Heart pounding. Then the car door shut again, and it drove off into the night. When I got back home, a brown envelope was waiting under my door. Inside was a USB drive. I plugged it into the laptop. Hesitated. Then opened the single video file inside. It was security footage. The timestamp showed the night before Blake's accident. His car parked in the Horizon lot. A shadowy figure moving near the hood. Crouched by the front wheel. Then static. The video ended. I sat there in the dark. The hum of the computer fan filling the silence. Someone had made sure Blake would never speak again. I didn't know who had sent the video, or why they wanted me to see it. But one thing was certain. The story wasn't buried. It was alive. Just like my brother. And now, someone wanted it to stay hidden. No matter the cost. I didn't sleep that night. The footage kept replaying in my head. The shadow near Blake's car. The way the camera cut to static right before it could show a face. Whoever sent that drive wanted me to know the truth. But not all of it. It wasn't justice. It was a warning. By sunrise, I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. Michael was upstairs, still under observation. Doctor Lang passed through, spotted me, and came over. She looked as exhausted as I felt. "You've been here every day," she said gently. "You need rest." I shook my head. "Rest doesn't change anything." She studied me for a moment. Then sigged. "Your brother's getting stronger. Physically, at least. But he's restless. He's talking about leaving." "Leaving where?" She hesitated. "He says he feels watched. I've checked with security. But nothing unusual has happened. Still, I think it's part of his trauma. He's struggling to separate fear from memory." I nodded. But her words sat heavy in my chest. I thanked her and went upstairs. Michael was sitting up, staring out the window. When I walked in, he smiled faintly, then went back to watching the gray skyline. "You know that coffee smells like dirt," he said. I laughed quietly. "You sound like yourself again." He didn't answer right away. His face looked clearer now, but there was still a kind of distance in his eyes, like he was half somewhere else. "I saw Blake on the news," he said finally. "They said it was an accident. That's what they're calling it. You don't believe that, do you?" He shook his head. "Someone wanted him gone." I sat down beside the bed. "Whoever did it sent me a video of the car." His eyes widened. "Why?" "I don't know. Maybe to scare me. Maybe to shut me up." Michael's hands tightened on the blanket. "Ethan, you need to stop." I looked at him. "After what they did to you." He met my eyes. "It's over. He's dead. That's enough." I almost said it wasn't enough. That I wanted everyone who'd helped Blake to answer for what they'd done. But then I saw the way he looked. The tremor in his fingers. The dark circles under his eyes. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted peace. 2 days later, the police released Blake's final report. Mechanical failure. Closed case. Laura called me and said there was nothing left to chase without him. Horizon was already dissolving. Assets liquidated. Lawyers would stall everything for years. I told her I understood. But I didn't. That weekend I brought Michael home with me. My house felt smaller than I remembered. He moved slow. Like someone testing gravity. The first night he barely ate. He sat on the couch with a blanket around him, eyes flicking to every sound. I woke up once to find him standing in the kitchen, staring at the door. When I asked what he was doing, he said he thought he heard trucks. "There's no one here." I told him, "You're safe." He nodded. But I knew he didn't believe it. Over the next few weeks, he started therapy with Dr. Lang. Twice a week. Sometimes 3, when the nightmares got bad. She said recovery wasn't about remembering everything but about learning how to live with what he did remember. I watched him fight his way back piece by piece. He went outside again, took short walks, started reading old car manuals like he used to. Some mornings I'd find him in the garage tinkering with my truck, humming quietly. It felt almost normal. Samantha came by one afternoon to drop off Ben, my 8-year-old. She hadn't seen Michael since before the accident. When she stepped through the door and saw him sitting at the kitchen table, she stopped cold. She whispered his name. And he stood, awkward but smiling. She hugged him like she was afraid he'd disappear again. Later that night, after Ben was asleep, she and I sat on the back porch. The lake shimmered faintly under the porch light. She looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You've carried this for a long time," she said. "It's hard to put it down. You can. You just have to let it stay in the past." I stared at the water. The past doesn't stay buried if someone's still digging it up. She reached over and touched my arm. "Then stop digging. You found him. That's what matters." I wanted to argue. But the truth was, I was tired of being angry. I just nodded. The next morning, an envelope was waiting in the mailbox. No return address. Just my name in neat handwriting. Inside was a photo printed on cheap paper. It showed the night of the crash. The same image Jack Peterson had described. Two men carrying someone between them. But this one was clearer. You could see the young man's face. Michael. Scrawled on the bottom edge were 3 words. You weren't wrong. I called Laura. I told her about it. She said not to overthink it. Could be someone from the old crew finally telling the truth. But the timing felt deliberate. Blake was dead. The company gone. Now someone was cleaning up the rest. That evening Michael was quieter than usual. He sat on the porch steps with Ben, teaching him how to skip rocks. When I asked if he was all right, he smiled without looking up. I'm starting to remember little things, he said. Faces. A woman's voice. She helped me once when I was sick. I think she worked for them. Do you know her name? He shook his head. No. Just her voice. He picked up another rock and threw it hard. It skipped once. Twice. Then sank. Maybe she's the one who helped me get out. The thought settled between us like the evening air. Heavy, but not unwelcome. Later that night, as I locked up the house, I looked at the phone sitting on my desk. The old messages were still there, backed up and saved. I played the first voicemail again out of habit. The static filled the room, followed by Michael's voice. Weak and trembling. Ethan. Please pick up. But this time, when it reached the end, there was something new. A faint echo layered under his words. Almost like another recording had merged with it. A woman's voice whispered, "He's safe now." I stared at the phone until the screen went dark. Outside, rain began to fall again. Soft and steady against the windows. I stood there listening, wondering if peace ever really came, or if it just changed its shape, waiting for you to stop chasing it. The rain didn't stop for 2 days. Like the sky was washing the world clean of everything that had happened. I spent most of that time inside, keeping close to Michael, making sure he ate, trying to give him space when he needed it. He'd started talking more, but his memories came in fragments. Little flashes of moments that didn't always make sense. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence, go quiet, and just stare out the window. Dr. Lang said that was normal. That recovery comes in waves. Still, every silence felt like another piece of the past, trying to surface. One evening I found him in the garage again. He had the hood of my old Chevy open, grease on his hands, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It looked like peace, or something close to it. I leaned against the doorframe. You remember how to do all that? He nodded. Muscle memory. I guess. Some things stick even when the rest doesn't. We worked side by side for a while without saying much. The air smelled like oil and rain. The kind of smell that takes you back before you even realize it. After a while, he said quietly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't called you that night?" Every day. He looked up at me then. You think I would have died out there? I shook my head. No. I think you'd have found a way to survive. You always did. He smiled faintly, then went back to tightening a bolt. That night we ate dinner together with Samantha and Ben. For the first time, it felt almost normal. Ben showed Michael how to play a game on his tablet. And Michael laughed when he lost. I hadn't heard that laugh in over 20 years. It didn't sound like the boy I remembered. But it was real. After they went to bed, I sat on the porch again with a beer in hand. The lake was calm, moonlight reflecting off the water. I thought about everything that had happened. Blake's death, the crash, the voicemail, the woman's voice. I still didn't know who had sent the footage or the photo. I wasn't sure if I ever would. The phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was Laura. I hesitated before answering. She said the investigation into Horizon had officially closed. The federal inquiry found no remaining assets. New employees to prosecute. It was over. At least on paper. You sound disappointed. She said. I don't know what I sound like anymore. You did what you could. Sometimes that has to be enough. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time listening to the sound of frogs down by the water. Maybe she was right. Maybe justice didn't always look like a headline or a courtroom. Sometimes it just meant saving one life. Even if it came decades late. A week later, Dr. Lang stopped by the house to check on Michael. She said his progress was remarkable. His memory was patchy but stable. His physical recovery almost complete. She told me that he might never remember everything. And maybe that was a mercy. Before she left, she said something that stuck with me. Healing isn't about finding the person you used to be. It's about learning to live with the person you became. After she drove off, Michael came out carrying a box. Inside were old photographs. Some from before the crash. Some recent ones, of the two of us. He sat beside me and handed me one. It was a picture of us as kids, sitting on the hood of Dad's old pickup, both of us grinning at the camera. I forgot this picture existed, he said softly. Mom took it the summer before you left for college. She made us hold still for 5 minutes until we both started laughing. He traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. I think I'm starting to remember that day. We sat in silence for a while. The air was cool and smelled like pine. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel heavy. That night I dreamed of the crash again. Only this time, instead of twisted metal and snow, I saw Michael standing on the side of the highway, watching me from the other side. He smiled and waved. And then the scene faded into sunlight. When I woke up, I felt lighter, like something had finally loosened inside me. A month passed. Michael started working part-time at a repair shop downtown. The owner, an old friend of mine, knew his story and kept it quiet. He said Michael was good with his hands. Patient. Careful. Never lost his temper. Every evening he came home smelling like motor oil. And I could tell it made him feel useful again. One evening after work, he found me out back chopping wood. He picked up a log and said, "You know, I've been thinking." About what? About finding the families of the others who didn't make it. Maybe they deserve to know what really happened. You sure you're ready for that? He looked at me, his expression steady. I'll never be ready. But I can't move forward if I keep pretending it ended with me. I nodded. Then we'll do it together. For the first time, he didn't argue. That weekend we started planning. Laura helped us pull public records. Old archives. Anything that might lead to the names of those other workers. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. A few days later, a letter arrived addressed to me. No return name. Just a Seattle postmark. Inside was a single page with one sentence written in neat handwriting. You're not alone in this. There was no signature. But I knew. The woman Michael remembered, the one who'd helped him escape, was still out there. That night, as the sun set behind the trees, I sat on the porch again. Michael joined me with 2 beers. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. After a while, he said quietly, "Do you think Mom knows?" I looked up at the stars and smiled. "I think she does." He nodded and leaned back in his chair, watching the sky. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined. But maybe that was the point. Life doesn't hand out perfect endings. It gives you chances to start again. And you either take them or you don't. I took a long breath and let it go, feeling the night settle around us. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a call, or a knock at the door, or another secret to crawl out of the dark. I had my brother back. That was enough. If you've made it this far, tell me what you think. Would you have done what I did, or would you have left the past buried? Sometimes I wonder if chasing the truth heals you, or if it just reminds you how much you've already lost. Either way, thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next story.